Pay very close attention to what I'm about to walk you through, because this is one of the most dramatic real-time confrontations between a city government and its financial industry that America has seen in decades. And unlike most of the stories on this channel, this one is not a slow burn trend unfolding over years. This one exploded in a matter of weeks with a viral video, a billionaire counterattack, a $6 billion investment thrown into question, a private equity giant with $900 billion in assets announcing it is looking for the exits, and a mayor who came into office promising to tax the rich, now watching the rich start making very concrete, very expensive decisions about where they want to be. The city is New York. The mayor is Zohran Mamdani. The companies are Citadel, Apollo Global Management, and Starwood Capital, three of the most powerful financial firms in the world. And the story is still moving right now, as of the day I'm recording this. I'm Inspector James, and this is what is actually happening. Let's start with who Zohran Mamdani is, because if you haven't been following New York politics closely, the fact that this man is now the 112th mayor of New York City is itself a story worth understanding. Mamdani is 34 years old. He is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He was born in Kampala, Uganda, became a naturalized American citizen in 2018, and spent 4 years as a New York State Assembly member representing Astoria, Queens, before running for mayor. His parents are an Indo-Ugandan academic father and Indian filmmaker Mira Nair, the director of Monsoon Wedding. During his campaign, he promised to tax the wealthy, expand tenant protections, and deliver on a cost-of-living agenda for working New Yorkers. The financial industry spent over $40 million trying to stop him. They backed his main rival, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, poured resources into the race, and made their opposition to Mamdani as public and as expensive as any political campaign in recent New York history. On November 4th, 2025, Mamdani won anyway. He took office on January 1st, 2026. And within his first 4 months in office, he managed to trigger one of the most concrete, most financially meaningful confrontations with Wall Street that any American mayor has ever provoked. The confrontation crystallized on tax day, April 15th, 2026. Mamdani posted a social media video announcing a new pied-à-terre tax on luxury second homes, properties valued above $5 million, whose owners do not primarily live in the city. The policy itself was not surprising. It was a campaign promise he had made explicitly. What was surprising, what turned a routine policy announcement into a national story, was how he chose to deliver it. Mamdani filmed the video standing directly outside 220 Central Park South, one of the most expensive residential buildings in the world. He looked into the camera, leaned forward, and identified this specific penthouse inside that building that he was referencing. The $238 million penthouse owned by Ken Griffin, the founder and CEO of Citadel, one of the world's most profitable hedge funds. This is an annual fee on luxury properties worth more than $5 million, whose owners do not live full-time in the city. Like for this penthouse, which hedge fund CEO Ken Griffin bought for $238 million, Mamdani said in the video. He said he had secured the pied-à-terre tax and that it would raise $500 million annually for the city. And he delivered all of this with what witnesses described as a slow, deliberate lean toward the camera that Griffin himself would later call creepy and weird. Ken Griffin's reaction was not a polite statement issued through a spokesperson. It was immediate, public, and it came with a financial consequence attached. Speaking at the Milken Institute Global Conference in early May 2026, Griffin told CNBC, "I couldn't believe what I was watching. I had to watch it twice before it fully sank in." He said the video was in poor taste, really poor taste. And then he said something that every financial analyst and every New York City budget official should have heard as a 5-alarm warning. In reaction to New York, we filed a permit with the city of Miami. We've added several 100,000 square feet of new space in our new building. He said the decision to expand in Miami had been made with no regrets. And he explicitly stated, publicly at a major conference on camera, that Citadel would double down on Miami specifically because of the mayor's actions, saying they want to be in a state that embraces business, embraces education, embraces personal freedom and liberty. He also said that a multi-billion-dollar redevelopment project Citadel had been planning on Park Avenue in Manhattan, a project worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 billion, had become a real topic of debate. Not canceled yet, but debated. And in a city that desperately needs that kind of private investment, debated is a word that carries enormous weight. Griffin also raised something that sent a chill through the room when he said it. He referenced the 2024 assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, who was shot outside a Midtown Manhattan hotel not far from Griffin's own penthouse, and said that Mamdani's video, by publicly identifying his residence and casting him as a symbol of inequality, put me in harm's way. His firm's chief operating officer, Gerald Beeson, sent an internal memo to Citadel staff calling Mamdani's move shameful and saying the mayor had demonstrated ignorance and disdain toward people who had been consistently committed to building one of the greatest cities in the world. The memo said Citadel's principals and employees were told clearly, "We need to double down on Miami because we want to be in a state that embraces business." Griffin, speaking at the 2026 Milken Conference, put it more simply. "When we moved from Chicago," he said, "there was a debate between New York and Miami. It's unquestionably true that we made the right choice. I'll leave it at that." And then he added, with a directness that should echo in every corner of City Hall, "Here's the real question. Is New York going to put their fiscal house in order and run itself from a position of a strong government that is pro-business, or are they looking to play to their base?" Now let's back up for a moment and give you the full context on Citadel specifically, because the scale of what Griffin is moving and what New York stands to lose is not captured by the phrase, "hedge fund CEO doubles down on Miami." Citadel is not just any hedge fund. It is one of the most profitable investment firms in history. Griffin himself is worth approximately $47 billion. Citadel moved its headquarters from Chicago to Miami in 2022, citing runaway crime and rising taxes in the Windy City. At the time, Griffin made a very public statement about why he was leaving, and Chicago's response was broadly similar to what Mamdani is now doing in New York, which is to say the city's progressive leadership largely dismissed the departure as a loss it could absorb. Chicago has been absorbing the consequences of that dismissal ever since. Now Griffin is in Miami. Citadel is expanding its Miami footprint by several 100,000 additional square feet, directly in response to Mamdani's video. And the $6 billion Manhattan redevelopment that was supposed to be Citadel's statement of long-term commitment to New York is sitting in a state of genuine uncertainty. The Citadel story is not a footnote. It is the most concrete and most financially tangible consequence of Mamdani's opening months in office, and it is measured in billions of dollars of capital that is either coming to Manhattan or going to Miami. But Citadel is not the only name on this list, not even close. In late March 2026, Apollo Global Management, one of the most powerful private equity firms in the world, a company with more than $900 billion in assets under management, employing more than 6,000 people globally, sent a memo to its partners and employees that could not have been clearer in its meaning. The memo stated, "We've shared with our teams across Apollo and Athene that we plan to establish a second headquarters in either Texas or South Florida, alongside NYC. This decision is driven by the talent we want to hire and the firm we want to be. New York does not have a monopoly on talent, and we expect most of our future growth will take place in our second HQ." Read that last sentence again. A company with $900 billion in assets under management, headquartered in Manhattan, is telling its employees that most of its future growth will take place somewhere that is not New York. The locations being considered were Austin, Nashville, and South Florida, all markets that have been actively positioning themselves as destinations for exactly this kind of financial firm migration. The new Apollo hub could eventually house up to 1,000 employees over time, a number roughly equivalent to Apollo's current New York headcount. In other words, over time, Apollo is planning to build a parallel operation in a southern state that matches what it currently has in Manhattan. The memo framed this as being about talent, but it arrived squarely in the middle of the Mamdani pied-à-terre tax controversy, and multiple sources told reporters it was driven at least in part by the direction New York's political environment was heading. Apollo paid $1, 276 billion in income taxes in 2025. That is the kind of taxpayer that a city needs to keep, not provoke. The third major name that entered this story in the weeks immediately following Mamdani's election, before he even took office, was Barry Sternlicht, the billionaire chairman and CEO of Starwood Capital Group, a real estate and investment firm with $9 billion in total assets. Just days after Mamdani's November 2025 election victory, Sternlicht went on CNBC and delivered a blunt assessment that has only grown more relevant with every week that has passed since. He said his New York team was, for the first time, saying maybe we should leave. He said that if Mamdani's policies created an environment where people felt their families were not safe, they would leave. He questioned whether a city that elected a democratic socialist mayor understood what it was doing to its own economic future. And he offered a line that should be carved into the wall of every budget office in the city. People are working really hard. Just how do we help others to do well and believe in the American dream? Sternlicht said he believed New York would survive. It survived de Blasio, he noted, but that it would get a lot worse before it gets better. He also said something that captures the paradox at the heart of this entire debate. The people Mamdani is targeting are not just wealthy individuals enriching themselves. They are the employers, the investors, the capital allocators who create the jobs, pay the taxes, and finance the construction that keeps New York running. When you make them feel unwelcome, When your mayor films a video outside a man's home using it as a political prop, you're not just making a statement about values. You are sending a signal about what kind of city New York intends to be. And that signal is being received. Now here is where the story gets genuinely complicated because I want to be accurate with you, not just give you one side. The data picture on whether businesses are actually leaving New York right now is more nuanced than the headlines suggest. At the time of recording, Manhattan's commercial real estate market has actually shown strength in early 2026. According to data from JLL, a major real estate firm, first quarter 2026 office leasing activity in Manhattan was up, rents were up, and vacancy rates were declining as AI companies and other firms aggressively signed new leases. A JLL white paper disputed what they called the myth of the mass exodus, finding that New York remains a greater magnet for young talent than Florida. Analysts who are sympathetic to Mamdani's agenda point out that so far, the corporate departures are mostly plans and signals rather than completed moves. Permits filed in Miami, memos sent to employees, announcements of future hires happening elsewhere. The actual headcount reductions in New York from Mamdani-related departures are small so far. Citibank cut 265 employees at its Greenwich Street location, but sources said it was unrelated to Mamdani. Amazon reduced its New York office by 135 people, also said to be unrelated. One analyst told NY1, despite these claims that businesses have been relocating, it just hasn't shown up in the numbers. Another commentator, the president of a business coalition, put it more bluntly but more honestly. It takes a lot to push these people out, that's the truth. But there is a tripwire at some point. Well, that last quote is the one I want you to hold on to because it is the most honest and the most important thing anyone has said about this situation. It takes a lot to push the biggest financial firms out of New York. The city has genuine, irreplaceable advantages. The talent pool, the density of counterparties, the cultural infrastructure, the network effects of being in the same city as every major bank, law firm, and advisory business in the country. Those advantages are real, and they are not going to disappear because of one mayor's first 6 months in office. But, and this is a very large, but those advantages have been eroding for years in ways that predate Mamdani entirely. JP Morgan Chase, the largest bank in America, now has more employees in its Dallas, Texas operation than in New York City. CEO Jamie Dimon confirmed it explicitly in his April 2026 shareholder letter and said the trend would likely continue. Goldman Sachs is building an 800,000 square foot campus in Dallas. Wells Fargo opened an 850,000 square foot campus in Texas in 2025. AllianceBernstein moved its headquarters to Nashville. These firms did not leave New York because of Mamdani, but they moved significant portions of their workforce to lower cost states, while New York's political environment was doing nothing to stop the underlying trend. And now Mamdani has arrived, and in his first 100 days, he has managed to accelerate that existing trend by making two of the most powerful financial executives in the world, Ken Griffin and Mark Rowan, publicly, explicitly commit to putting future growth outside of New York. That is not nothing. That is a structural shift in direction with compounding consequences over time. The budget numbers tell the story of what New York City stands to lose if the tripwire gets hit. Mamdani inherited what he described as a $12 billion deficit when he took office, the largest fiscal gap since the Great Recession, left over from the Adams administration. He has proposed a $124.7 billion budget for fiscal year 2027. He announced in May 2026 that he had closed the gap to zero, down to zero in his own words. And technically that is true, but the way the gap was closed is instructive about the fragility of the situation. The state of New York provided $4 billion in additional support. Governor Kathy Hochul and the state legislature authorized pension liability restructuring that saves the city $900 million in the near term, but will cost more in the long run. The pied-à-terre tax that Mamdani famously promoted outside Ken Griffin's penthouse is projected to raise $500 million per year. But the city's own comptroller estimated that behavioral changes by wealthy property owners could reduce that to between $340 million and $380 million. Behavioral changes is a technical term for what happens when rich people sell their apartments rather than pay a new annual tax on them. If enough of them do that, and billionaires have the mobility and the financial incentive to do exactly that, the tax raises far less than projected. The budget gap closes temporarily and then reopens in a future year when those high-value properties no longer exist to be taxed, and the owners who used to pay income taxes in the city have relocated to Florida. Budget watchdogs have warned that the one-time measures Mamdani used to close the gap, pension deferrals, state bailout funds, delayed mandates, create structural problems that will come due in future years. The Empire Center for Public Policy noted that the pension re-amortization alone will save the city $900 million now, but cost more in the long run. This is the fiscal version of putting the debt on a credit card. It solves this month's bill, but grows next year's problem. Let's talk about the pied-à-terre tax itself in more detail, because it is simultaneously Mamdani's biggest political win and his most dangerous gamble. The tax applies to non-primary residences valued above $5 million. Owners would pay an additional annual tax ranging from 5% to 4% of the property's market value, on top of existing property taxes. Mamdani and Governor Hochul announced a deal on the tax in April 2026, with the governor calling it a historic first for New York. The city's budget projects $500 million in annual revenue from the tax, but the details of how property values will be assessed have not been fully finalized. The implementation mechanics remain unsettled, and a key risk hangs over the entire calculation. Some owners of the affected properties will simply sell them rather than pay the ongoing tax. If Griffin sells his $238 million penthouse to avoid the tax, which is not an implausible decision for a man who lives in Florida, the tax generates zero ongoing revenue from that property, and the city loses whatever income tax revenue Griffin was paying as a part-time New York resident. Multiply that across hundreds of affected ultra-luxury properties, and the behavioral response could significantly undercut the projected revenue. The city comptroller has already publicly flagged this risk. The question is whether Mamdani's administration is managing it, or whether the political win of announcing the tax is being treated as more important than the fiscal reality of collecting it. The broader pattern that is playing out in New York in 2026 is one that should be deeply familiar to anyone who has been watching what happened in Chicago over the past several years. Ken Griffin moved Citadel out of Chicago in 2022, citing crime and taxes. Griffin said at the time that Chicago had become inhospitable to business and that Florida offered a fundamentally different governing philosophy. Chicago's political leadership broadly dismissed his departure as one billionaire's complaint. In the years since, Chicago has continued to struggle with outmigration, a weakening tax base, and a business environment that has failed to reverse the trend Griffin identified. Citadel did not come back. Neither did the gravitational pull of the financial industry that had been drifting away from the city for years. Griffin is now watching New York's leadership replicate, almost point by point, the same policy choices that drove him out of Chicago. He said it at the Milken Conference almost word for word. When we chose between New York and Miami back in 2022, we made the right choice. He's not saying it as a taunt. He is saying it as a warning. And the evidence that it is a warning worth heeding is right there in the Apollo memo, right there in the Citadel Miami expansion permit, right there in the Jamie Dimon shareholder letter, saying J.P. Morgan's New York headcount has shrunk 20% in 10 years, and the trend will likely continue. Mamdani's response to Griffin and to the broader Wall Street reaction has been a mixture of defiance and pragmatic flexibility that reveals a politician who is more sophisticated than his critics give him credit for, but also more constrained by fiscal reality than his supporters want to acknowledge. On the defiance side, his press secretary responded to Griffin's Milken Conference remarks by saying the mayor wants all New Yorkers to succeed, including business owners and entrepreneurs. Mamdani himself went further at a police ceremony, publicly thanking Griffin for a donation Citadel had made to the NYPD, an awkward acknowledgement that the man he had just used as a political prop was in fact contributing to the city's public safety infrastructure. On the pragmatic side, his actual budget contained none of the corporate or personal income tax increases he campaigned on. The state-enacted budget included zero of those tax hikes. The pied-à-terre tax, while real and while politically significant, raises a fraction of the revenue that Mamdani's campaign rhetoric implied. He balanced the budget through a state bailout, pension deferrals, and spending cuts, a very different toolkit than the tax the rich platform he ran on. What Mamdani has discovered in his first months in office is the same thing that every New York City mayor eventually discovers. The city's tax base is enormously concentrated in a small number of high earners and high-value properties. And those people and those assets have options. You can make them feel targeted. You can make policy arguments about fairness, but you cannot make them stay if you make the cost of staying, financial or reputational or psychological, exceed the cost of leaving. The stakes of this confrontation are not abstract for the people of New York who have nothing to do with hedge funds or private equity. New York City's budget depends on tax revenue from a very small number of extremely high earners in a way that makes it structurally vulnerable to the kind of outmigration that is now being discussed openly. 2/3 of New York City's income tax revenue comes from the top few percent of earners. When those earners leave, when a Griffin decides to make Miami his primary residence, when an Apollo partner takes a job at the new Texas hub rather than in Manhattan, the tax base contracts in ways that eventually show up in the services that ordinary New Yorkers depend on. School funding gets squeezed, transit maintenance gets deferred, libraries face budget pressure, the parks get less. The people who are least able to absorb those service cuts are the same working New Yorkers who voted for Mamdani because they believed he would make their lives better. The painful irony of aggressive tax-the-rich politics in a city as economically concentrated as New York is that the rich have the most ability to respond to those policies by leaving, and when they leave, It is the people who cannot leave, who bear the consequences of the resulting fiscal contraction. The story is not over, not even close. Apollo has not yet announced its final decision on where its second headquarters will be. The Griffin-Mamdani confrontation is still evolving, with Griffin meeting with Governor Hochul to discuss, in his words, the future direction of New York. The pied-à-terre tax has been announced but not yet fully implemented, and the details of its mechanics are still being worked out in Albany. The Partnership for New York City, the city's most prominent business lobbying organization, has described the Apollo and Citadel announcements as a troubling pattern taking shape. What the first 6 months of Mamdani's term have established beyond any reasonable doubt is this: the conversation that has been happening quietly for years about whether New York can maintain its status as the unquestioned center of American finance is now happening loudly, publicly, and with very specific names, very specific dollar amounts, and very specific decisions attached. The tripwire that one analyst described? Citadel hit it on tax day, April 15th, 2026, when a mayor filmed a video outside a man's home. Apollo hit it shortly thereafter when it told its employees that most future growth would happen outside New York. Barry Sternlicht identified it the day after Mamdani was elected. And Jamie Dimon, who has been the most careful and the most methodical about how he describes what is happening, confirmed it in his shareholder letter when he said, New York's headcount at JP Morgan has fallen 20% in a decade, and will likely keep falling. I'm Inspector James. The battle between Mamdani and Wall Street is the most consequential economic story happening in New York right now, and possibly in America. It is a test of whether the most famous financial city on earth can afford, literally afford, to govern itself as if the people and companies who fund its budget will always be there regardless of how they are treated. The early evidence from Citadel and Apollo and the broader migration of financial activity to Florida and Texas suggests the answer is no. New York does not have a divine right to Wall Street's loyalty any more than Chicago did, any more than California did when Chevron left after 145 years. Cities earn that loyalty every day through policy choices that make operating there worth the cost. Watch this space closely, because what happens next in this confrontation will determine not just who wins a political argument, but who writes the checks that keep New York City running for the next decade. Subscribe and stay ahead of it. I'll see you in the next one.